Hey everyone, welcome to the 5th season of Travel Tales, a podcast by Afar. I'm Aislyn, and yes, I host the show. Each week on the podcast, we hear stories of life-changing travel from poets, writers, entrepreneurs, authors, and so many more. And this season, we'll be sharing short Q&As inspired by each episode that you can only find here. This is Travel Tales. Welcome, Travel Tales.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're in New Orleans right now. Is that right?
I am. I am in New Orleans for 3 weeks, which is really fun. I feel a little bit like I'm living here, even though it's just a taste.
Totally.
But it's been an adventure for sure.
I don't think I've ever spent, usually I would go to New Orleans for like 4 or 5 days, but to actually get to live there a little bit, that's a pretty cool experience.
That's how it's been for me too, is the only other times I've been, it's, a wedding or a festival or something where you're kind of in and out. And we're living in a neighborhood called the Bywater. It's very much like a residential, neighborhood. I've got my local coffee place I go to. There's, and there's something really special and fun about that. We're just kind of enjoying life in a new place and imagining what it would be like if we were New Orleanians.
Exactly. Well, I was hoping we could start by having you kind of share your organization. Like, what is Wanderful? What do you do?
Yeah, so Wanderful is an international community of women who travel. We started as a blog in 2009, so I was traveling a lot on my own and just experiencing the world as a solo traveler, as somebody who had not traveled a lot before and was looking for resources and support and advice. And I think back then, and even still today, honestly, when we look up, advice about traveling alone as women, usually we get a lot of really scary content about the dangerous things that can happen to us, and I wanted something that was a little bit more real and honest and uplifting and talked through the hard things, but also celebrated the joy of traveling and traveling alone. So the blog transformed into this international community that's all about really changing the face of travel and showcasing more women. I mean, women dominate the travel industry, but we're so underrepresented in leadership, in marketing, in the stories that are being told about travel. And so we have a big creator network where we share, we will do marketing campaigns and really help these small business owners grow. We have hubs all around the world that connect travelers together. And we're really working to just create a supportive and connected environment for women for whom travel is a huge part of what they do and who they are.
I love it. I mean, it's amazing what grew out of your own kind of solo adventures. And your podcast, the name of your podcast also fits that theme. Can you kind of share the story behind?
Yeah. So the podcast is called 85%. And the reason for that is because 85% of travel decisions are made by women. And we don't think about that or realize that. And actually, we don't really sit with that either. That such a huge part of travel decision making comes from women. And then when you sort of analyze it, you realize, okay, well, a lot of times it's a woman who's making the travel plans for her family. 92% of receptionists are still women. So a lot of women that are booking corporate travel. And so all of the decisions in travel are still being really very much held by women as decision makers. And then, of course, there's the sort of paradox that we don't speak to women. We don't really represent women when we talk about travel. And so I wanted to share a little bit more of those stories and that advice. And so 85%, it will do an interview with a really phenomenal woman who is in travel, who's really kind of fundamentally changing travel for the better. But then there's also this really beautiful storytelling component. So it's very kind of narrative, and it goes through her own travel journeys in a moment that really changed the way she saw the world. And then some of her advice for everyone else along the way.
It's so cool. It's a great podcast. And
thanks.
How have you seen the travel industry change since you started? Like, do you think there is more representation?
I think there's more. I don't think we're there yet. But actually what's been really interesting and fun and special about all of it is in our own journey, which has been now 15 years since, the beginning of this blog, I think it's also been interesting watching not only representation increase ever so slowly, but also the intersections and the nuances of that. So to give you an example, and this follows the line, I think, of content creation. So in the early days of, blogging and like Instagram wasn't even a thing yet, it was a lot of these kind of young 20-something women who are kind of going out into the world. Now those same women are having kids. So the stories that we're talking about now are not just about, being young, wild, and free. It's also about how do you foster a global mindset among your children, or how do you travel solo even as a mom? And I think in that way, it's been really interesting because a lot of those things have not been talked about certainly enough before. And so are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think there has been, especially with the way media has evolved in general, this sort of democratization of voice. And that's where I love the creator industry as well, because it's all of these travelers who are just grassroots sharing their own experiences and being kind of the representation that they want to see. And that has evolved for sure.
And that question of like how your travel identity shifts over your lifetime, that's such an interesting one. Like as you assume different roles, from young single person to in a relationship to potentially having children, like who are you as a traveler and how does that shift?
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing that I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for as travelers, but also just as a world. I think we always talk about travel in these categories, right? Like budget travel, luxury travel, and then we sort of identify along those categories. Like I'm a luxury traveler, but I'm not a luxury traveler. Sometimes I am, but sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm a solo traveler, but sometimes I travel with my kids, and sometimes I travel on a bachelorette weekend. And I think it's so easy for us to oversimplify that, but really we are all very complex humans that sometimes, splurge on things and sometimes don't. And in fact, I challenge you to go, stay at a really fancy hotel and then have lunch at McDonald's, because why not? We can all do that. And so, so I think that's been something that we can think about even more too, of the evolution of the way we travel and who we are as people, and the fact that these categories are flexible and they change, and the way we travel changes with our life and our job situation and the time of year and our relationship status and how we're feeling that day and how much money is in our bank account and all of that stuff.
Well, how did you fall in love with travel in the first place? Like what led you to those early adventures?
I think the very first travel experience for me actually was studying abroad. And my family is Portuguese. I grew up not knowing a whole lot about my culture. My dad grew up in the States, but his whole family was from Portugal, and they really tried to assimilate him into American culture. And so when I was growing up, I was pretty disconnected from all of that. And something in me was like, I want to go to Portugal to study abroad and just reconnect with my roots. And I was there for a year, and it was the most eye-opening experience, I think, for me. That's really the understatement of the year, and also the only way to describe it, because just, this part of me opened that I didn't even know existed, like this door, and I stayed with family who live in rural Portugal. Yeah. So at that point I had been outside of the country for maybe one time, maybe twice, once when I was 2, but so I really hadn't traveled outside of the country a lot. And so imagine me at, 20 years old, and I'm living with my cousin Natalia, who lives in rural Portugal. Like, I remember waking up one morning in my bed, which was in their guest room, and I heard this noise that sounded like lawnmowers. And I was like, who is mowing their lawn at like 6 a.m? It was cows. There were like 20 cows in the driveway just standing there. And I ran out of the room, and I was like, and Natalia doesn't really speak English that much, and I don't really speak Portuguese, and I'm kind of learning. And I'm like, Natalia, look outside, look out. And she goes and she runs to the front door, and she's like, oh God, those freaking cows again. They're always over here. Like as if it was something that was just annoying and happened every day. And I still remember being like, wait, what? Like, that's normal? Like, what? There's cows in the driveway. And I mean, that's just one of the examples of the many experiences that I had, just completely being outside of myself and realizing how different people had lived. You know, it felt to me like I was on Mars, honestly. But at the same time, this like interesting feeling of, you know, especially because this was a heritage trip, you know, sort of being like, wow, I feel so disoriented. And at the same time, I feel like I'm connecting with this part of myself that I never knew. And it was like this really special kind of magical combination.
Yeah, it sounds quite delicious. And like there's a lot of growth that can come from that intersection, you know?
So much growth. Yeah. In so many ways. And has been a lifelong thing, you know, and I think that fueled my love of travel. Actually, the difficulty of that year abroad is actually one of the things that I think has really fueled my love of travel, and something I talk about a lot, which is that travel is not always a perfect or beautiful or tied up in a package or, you know, gorgeously photoshopped pictures all the time. I mean, actually, some of the most rich and wonderful parts of travel are the things that you're really working through in the moment. And then you take a step back and you reflect and you realize how much you've grown. And I think that that's something that we should, you know, talk about more is those opportunities for growth.
And like the discomfort, you know, that can come. And sometimes that discomfort does not go away, right? Especially in a place that is very different. And when you don't speak the language, sometimes it's only when you come home that you can kind of appreciate it fully, I think. But sitting with that discomfort, seeking it out, I think is really healthy.
Well, and important and also not finished. You know, I love that you were saying that sometimes you don't sort through it. So my book, Wander Woman, which I published in March of 2024, it's a guide, really kind of part manifesto, part travel guide for women who are hoping to travel alone. And, you know, I recommend it for anyone who's, whether it's your first trip or your 50th, I think there's something to learn. But we talk a lot about, we talk a lot about some of the more abstract things, and actually discomfort is something I talk about a lot, which is, you know, actively putting yourself in a position of discomfort and being willing to try something new, being willing to step outside that comfort zone. That actually to me is like the defining factor of a travel experience. And you know, and the willingness to do that. And also that's really hard, because sometimes you're going to find as a traveler that you're in an uncomfortable situation. And even after the fact, you're going to realize, wow, I'm still uncomfortable about that. You know, like that's still something that I don't agree with, or that I thought was wrong, or I thought was different. And you as a traveler, it's really hard, because you are only there for a short period of time, and you cannot affect, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years of culture in your 1 week vacation. And so there's this sort of personal reckoning that you have to do too in an immersive travel experience, to say, there are going to be things that I love about this place. There are going to be things that I really wonder if this is right. And I also have to be able to sit with that discomfort and, you know, and still move on with this very beautifully complicated world.
I love that. And maybe sitting outside of judgment, you know, like sitting with the discomfort and also not making an executive decision that it's wrong, you know, especially if it's something that feels different than maybe your morals or how you live your life. Like, not sitting in that judgment, I think, can be really important, because you don't know. I think,
and you know what? I think there are times where you go there and you're so vehemently opposed, and then you go home or you take a step and you're like,
totally.
Nope, I'm wrong. I was the one who was wrong. Yep, that's not the right, you know, and I think that's
like pushed
where
a button.
It pushed a button. Yeah, it's like you saw something in a different way and you went, wow, this thing that I thought was completely wrong, I'm now seeing somebody live in that way, or with that lifestyle, or making that choice. And they actually look really happy, and it seems like it's worked out really well. And maybe I was wrong this whole time about that. And I think that's a neat component. Even just like the little things, like, you know, my first time living in Europe, and I saw people holding their knife and fork differently. And I was like, what are you all doing? And they're like, what are you doing? And I was like, you know what? Your way is way more efficient than our way. I think I'm going to do that from now on. And you know what? That kind of stuff can happen anywhere. I mean, we love to think about it in travel, like, oh, this stuff happens thousands of miles away in like some tiny rural village in the middle of nowhere, et cetera, et cetera. It can happen down your street. And I think that, that you don't have to go actually very far in order to have these very transformative travel experiences like that.
I totally agree. I just did a solo road trip through Colorado and had a bunch of experiences that kind of I was amazing. Like I was outside of my comfort zone in several different instances. And I was like, oh, this feels like a trip that like fosters some growth. And I would not really have expected that. But of course, you know, it was all new situation, different people going from rural to urban and seeing those differences. Are there any myths that you talk about in your book that kind of get attributed to solo travel and women in particular?
Actually, yeah. The whole first part of the book is about myth busting. I mean, it could have been like a whole book, just the myth busting, because there is. I mean, the first myth being that, well, let's talk about them not in order, because I think the first one that everyone thinks about is the safety factor. And that's the first thing we talk about in women traveling alone is, okay, it's unsafe. You know, Liam Neeson is going to have to find you and save you because you're going to get kidnapped and, you know, something's going to happen. We don't have the time or the resources to really break through this. You have to read the book. But safety is a very complex issue that's not given the time and attention that it deserves. It is based on many, many things. It's based on what I like to call your personal risk profile. You know, who you are, what do you look like? How much have you traveled before? Where are you going? What language is spoken there? What time of day are you walking around? You know, there's so many different things that go into that to determine are you safe or unsafe? And I think sometimes we look for one very easy answer. Let's look at a top 10 list of safest places for solo female travelers. Yeah. And I look at these lists, and usually they're country lists. So, you know, the top 10 countries for solo women travelers. And I say, could you rank your own country? I mean, every country is so different. How could you possibly do that? You know, and also, what does that do to a place's, you know, because there's also these lists that are like top 10 worst places to visit. And I'm going, what is that doing to a place's tourism to just automatically write off the entire country as a top worst place to visit? So I think this is a very nuanced and very complex issue. I'm not saying that there are not things that you should be aware of as a solo traveler. I think anyone traveling alone needs to understand that, yes, they're more vulnerable. Yes, they don't have somebody else's eyes and ears around, you know, to be there for them. But also, I think at the same time, I do believe that sometimes it is oversimplified and sort of overemphasized how dangerous it could be. So I think that's one myth that really needs to be given more time and attention. I think the other ones are who solo travel is for. So if you go on Google and you look up solo female traveler right now, you're going to see a lot of young 20-year-old white, Western, able-bodied, presumably English-speaking women who have their hands up in the air and are sitting on a really beautiful mountain. Like that's basically what you're going to see. And it discounts all of the amazing women that are out there and going out that look differently, that love differently, that believe in different things. And I think, again, kind of oversimplifying who the traveler is, it makes us so unseen. And it makes it really hard for other women. You know, I think it actually fits into the safety problem, because if you don't see a lot of different types of women traveling, then you're going to assume that a lot of types of women don't travel because it's, for whatever reason, dangerous or not accessible or not possible. And so I think that visibility is a problem. And then I think the last myth that I really think is important to talk about is just the myth of what solo travel even is. You know, I think we have this misconception that traveling alone means, you know, going to Cambodia for 6 months by yourself and, you know, not knowing anybody and not talking to anybody and just kind of being off in the world. And I know a lot of women who I'll say, have you been on a solo trip? And they'll say, well, no, but, you know, I've traveled for work before. And I'll say, well, were you alone on your work trip? And they'll say, yeah. And I'm like, well, then you've traveled solo before. I mean, it's not, you know, this is not rocket science. This doesn't have to be 6 months, you know, of a voyage somewhere by yourself. It could be a weekend trip. It could be an extension of a business trip. It's really just, it's the difference is you're choosing yourself. You're choosing yourself as a travel partner. You're choosing yourself to spend time with. And maybe you don't choose yourself. Maybe it's just, it happens, somebody quit on you, but you still chose to go anyway, and I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can travel alone without traveling alone. If that makes sense.
Yeah. You don't have to do like the eat, pray, love version of throwing your whole life out the window and running.
No. And in fact, now there are these small group trips that I kind of call solo travel's little sister. It's an experience with 10 to 12 people who are all traveling. It's not, a huge bus of people. So you're still getting the experience of being, in a small group. But also you don't know any of those people on your trip. So they're as much strangers to you as somebody you meet on the street.
Yeah. Yeah. You could do solo travel with other people. In a sense.
You can.
Yeah.
You can.
Oh, that's great. Well, I wanted to pivot to your travel tale, which kind of centers on these, very different attributes between you and your husband and how that created this wonderful memory. So I was curious if you had any tips for people who, their travel buddy is also very different from them and how you two navigate that as you
I love
navigate
that
the world.
question. I will be honest, it wasn't always easy, especially in the beginning. I mean, there are definitely times, and certainly the first couple trips we took where we would both be like, I'd be up at like 8 a.m, getting ready, making the coffee. And I'm like, why are you sleeping? We have things to do here. And he was like, what do you mean? This is my vacation. I mean, so for anyone who hasn't heard the whole tale yet, I am, as you now know, the person who, and we call this, we've actually realized this, we've discovered this as a couple, which is there's a difference between trips and vacations. And we were using them the same way, which led to the confusion. But I go on trips and he goes on vacations. And a vacation means you're sitting on a beach for 7 hours a day, not doing anything. And a trip means the exact opposite of that. And so we had to learn how to basically fuse the two together. And I think that just understanding those expectations is, of course, great. But sometimes even you think you do understand each other until you're actually there in the moment. Yeah. And then you realize, oh, wow, okay, no, you really like to just relax, or and I think just working through it, I think having the same things that make a good traveler, being open, taking things in stride, being patient with yourself. I honestly think those are the same things that require you to be a good travel partner. And I will give one tip, which is, having, and actually I've learned this, especially with having kids, which I think now means I have 4 travel partners instead of 1 that all have opinions, which is, this is not a solo trip. So you're not going to do everything you want to do, and get that out of your mind right now. You won't. You're going to be stressed out and exhausted the whole time. But if you can pick one thing, everybody who's traveling gets to pick one thing, and that's their non-negotiable. That's the thing that you want to do. So then, at least you can always say, like, I've done the thing I wanted to do. And what's funny? Sometimes I have that one thing and I never do it, and I never wanted to do it. It's like I get there and I go, you know what, that thing that I said that I really wanted to do, I'm good. Yeah. I actually feel good, and so, but having it on your list, then you can kind of say, okay, everybody's got their one priority. So nobody's going to be commandeering this trip. But also we're going to be open and flexible and sometimes the pick of the group or the thing that Marvin wanted to do, my husband, it ends up actually becoming my favorite thing. And the story may or may not be an example of that.
I think it's a great example of that, just of like you following his lead, setting your itinerary and to-do list aside, and then really kind of having this awakening, which is really cool. And I was curious to know, this is the last question, but have you changed since that? Like, has that kind of subtly infused the way that you travel?
What's funny is I actually had trouble. I'll be told, this is now the behind the scenes. I had trouble remembering who that person was, that me in that story. Because I have changed so fundamentally in the way I travel. I plan almost nothing now. I just go for it now. And it is. And it's funny. It didn't happen all at once, but certainly that was a big, part of that was just realizing how fun and enriching it was to go through, you know, and to kind of be like, wow, I can have an amazing trip basically no matter what I do. It's all just about my perspective and being present in the world. And, you know, and I still have lists, you know, here and there that I'll kind of pull together of, okay, I'm in Paris. Obviously I have to see the Eiffel Tower. Like that would be a miss, you know, but also I think there have definitely been times where I've showed up in a place and I have no idea what I'm doing, just no plan whatsoever. And I just go with it and I just ask people, and those are some of the most fun ones actually. And I have not regretted that for a minute.
I love that. And this idea of also letting your passions lead rather than like the best of lists that other people have put together, you know, like what are your interests? What do you like? Maybe it's a more obscure thing that isn't going to show up on a top 10 list of a city or a country. And
exactly.
You can have a really cool experience that way.
You can, and it leads to great stories, great dinner time stories. Yeah. And I will say, for anyone for whom this sounds horrifying, one thing, because I do understand there is an element of FOMO with a trip. You know, you're only there for a short period of time. Oh my gosh, what if you don't plan anything and then you're literally on your way out and the thing that you really wanted to do, you're missing. So I'm not saying don't do your research. You can. Yeah. But also one thing that I really like to do is I call it a day zero, which is you arrive in country and then you literally spend the day just being present. I'll go to the tourism office and, you know, pick up a bunch of brochures and look through them. Like that's when I'm researching, when I'm actually there. Because then, I don't know, it's different. You can talk to people, you have a better sense of like distance and where things are and how you get from place to place. It's not so conceptual like when you're planning at home. It's real. And so I think, you know, if you want to give yourself a day on your trip to have no plan and just kind of, you know, observe, take a walk, see what's around, you know, do a little bit of research, talk to people, use that as just your settling in day. And I think then the unmissable things you'll catch, you know, people will say, oh, obviously don't forget X, you know, like you'll find that fast. But then the other stuff, those obscure things that you're talking about, those things that really like speak to your own heart and your own interests, those are the things that'll also start to appear, you know, like you'll be like, oh, wow, there's a library down the street and they have like drag queen story hour. Oh, let's go. That sounds fun.
That's awesome.
Those little things that you're never going to find on a list.
Yeah. Exactly. I love that. Like day zero. It also gives you a moment to just settle in. You know, you've traveled, you've flown, you've driven, like you're probably a little tired. Yeah. You don't just have to hit the ground. Like, okay.
No, you don't have to. And you can, and I think there is a lot of pressure again, especially, you know, from a perspective of an American, when you have maybe just 2 weeks of paid vacation and you're like, everything needs to be optimized. I need to get out and I need to go. And even you land from your plane at the airport and you're like running. And then you realize, why am I running? Like, where am I running to? Where am I going? I'm going to wait at baggage claim anyway for half an hour, you know? So, even those moments when it's like the doors open and everyone's rushing out of the plane. And if you just kind of stop and think to yourself, you know, I have all the time in the world. And this is why I love traveling alone, because you really have all the time in the world. You're not on anybody else's agenda or schedule. You can just do whatever you want to do. If you want to sit in that airport for 2 hours and get a coffee and just people watch, you can.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to add about your podcast, your new book, your company?
Oh, goodness. I hope everyone just follows the journey. You can find me on Instagram at MaximumBeth. The book is my baby right now. It is really the book that I wish that I had been given those first few days that I arrived in Portugal with kind of, you know, bleary-eyed and wondering what was happening in the world and with me. And I think there's nobody that talks to us about that. I think, you know, study abroad programs, they prepare you for the academics. And, you know, I think a lot of great travel resources prepare you for the travel, but nobody prepares you for like the internal feelings that are going to happen. And this book does, you know, it talks through culture shock. It talks through planning for sure, but it also talks through some of the things that you're going to realize about what it's like being a woman in the world. And the reality is every place that we go as women and as men too, you know, for anyone watching, every place we go as people, we are perceived very differently. And you realize very fast when you're traveling, and especially traveling alone, that you are not viewing the world through a two-way mirror. People are seeing you just as you are seeing them. You are actively part of this place that you're visiting. And that means so many things. It means you have so many opportunities to build relationships and connect in a different way. It also means that you create an impact wherever you go. And there's a lot we should talk about related to, social impact and economic impact that's addressed in there. It also means that there are going to be uncomfortable moments because people are reacting to you and your physical presence or your voice or something that you say, and you might not have been prepared for that. So, so my hope is that this book is something that can be gifted, that someone can say, there's going to be so many things going through your mind in this moment, but this book is going to help you with that. And Wonderful. I hope that it helps a lot of people.
Well, congrats. We'll include a link below, but thank you so much, Beth. It's been really wonderful to chat with you and to see you,
Yeah, thank you, Aislyn. No, thanks for putting up with, we're hiding in a closet during the thunderstorm, so it's like so hot, but we made it.
Okay, that was our show. I'll include a link to the full episode below, and please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out.